thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about what has to be the most difficult issue we face as a country today, the war in Iraq. So I'm going to go through this speech. I've tried to cover a lot of ground in these remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. But this is such a difficult issue. I wanted to be as comprehensive as I could in reviewing the situation and reviewing our different options. The bottom line is we face a grim and sobering situation in Iraq. It is the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. And today, none of our choices are good. More than 160,000 courageous and capable American forces are in the dangerous position of trying to referee a bloody and intractable religious civil war that has been brewing in one form or another for 1,300 years. The President and his supporters remain committed to continue fighting this war in the hope that more American lives, more maimed American personnel, and more billions of American dollars will somehow achieve what nearly 3,800 American deaths, 25,000 wounded, and $500 billion American dollars have failed to achieve in the last 4.5 years. From people I talked to, a majority of Americans long ago concluded that this war was a mistake in the beginning. It has inspired more enemies determined to do us harm. It cannot be won militarily, and it is time to end it. They are desperate for new leadership that won't just keep rearranging the deck chairs, but will grab the wheel and steer us clear of the disaster lying ahead on the current course. That's why I am convinced we need more than a change in mission for fighting the war in Iraq. We need a change in policy that ends the war, compels the Iraqis to assume responsibility for their own security and their own future, and allows us to focus on the greatest threat to our nation's security, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups promoting global Islamic terrorism. To make this change in course, we need two things. First, we need a Congress that, instead of compromising over how to fight the war, will provide the leadership that forces this president to change policy by adopting a statutory deadline to end it. We need to reset our military forces and develop a new regional strategy that engages Iraq's neighbors and our allies to create a security framework that gives all of the countries in the region a stake in stability, both within Iraq and throughout the Middle East. My conclusions are based on living with this tragedy for 5 years, my observations and conversations during my recent trip to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, the recent reports on the President's surge strategy, and the hearings this week in both the House and the Senate. I visited Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and Pakistan during the first week of August as a member of a congressional delegation. It was my first trip to Iraq and my second to Afghanistan. The trip gave us all opportunities to listen to the soldiers, to discuss the situation with commanders, and assess firsthand the state of affairs in Iraq and in the region. We flew into Baghdad on Black Hawk helicopters wearing helmets and flakjacks for our protection. We drove around Kabul and Baghdad in armored SUVs with the same sort of protective gear. And I would say that that alone speaks volumes about the security situation in those places. Our delegation met with General Petraeus, with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, several Iraqi politicians, and some American troops. This was my first meeting with General Petraeus, though I met Ambassador Crocker 5 years ago in Afghanistan. Both are smart, experienced, and dedicated to their jobs. Both are concerned about the safety and well-being of our armed forces, and both are patriotic Americans. Most importantly, General Petraeus told me that, quote, "The U.S. can change its policy in Iraq, but my job is to react to conditions here on the ground." In other words, General Petraeus understood that he was not the commander-in-chief. He was clear that his responsibility was military strategy and tactics, and he conceded that policymakers in Washington must set overall policy in the region. I anticipated, as I think we have seen, that some politicians and pundits would portray his report as confirmation, as approval of the president's overall policy, rather than a status report on a limited set of political and military benchmarks. General Petraeus told me that the Army and Marines cannot sustain a force of 160,000 troops in Iraq without lengthening tours of duty again. And today for the Army it's 15 months. He admitted that the cycle of troop rotations on its own, without a change in policy, will reduce the size of the force in Iraq. And most important, the general told me that an American troop presence would be required in Iraq in some form for 9 or 10 years. 9 or 10 years more, 9 to 10 more years of Americans at war in Iraq is unacceptable to me and unacceptable to the American people. We cannot wait 9 or 10 years to reset our armed forces and address national security challenges put on hold by this misadventure in Iraq. There are two fundamentally different policies that we can take concerning Iraq. First, we can choose to keep U.S. troops in Iraq, either under the current mission or under a so-called changed mission. This strategy presumes that U.S. military operations are essential to a political solution. Under this approach, conditions on the ground will determine the departure of American personnel. Or, second, we can choose to remove troops from Iraq and bring them home or redeploy them elsewhere. This strategy presumes that U.S. military operations can no longer determine the fundamental dynamics on the ground in Iraq. Under this approach, the departure of U.S. forces would not depend on conditions on the ground. Advocates of the stay in Iraq approach argue that withdrawing U.S. troops is more dangerous than keeping them in the middle of the Iraqi civil war. This is the argument that President Bush makes and his supporters do as well. Advocates for leaving Iraq believe that failing to withdraw troops will, in the long run, be even more dangerous for us than keeping them there. That is what I believe, along with many other Democrats in Congress and some Republicans, including Senator Olympia Snowe.